What Lisa Weiss just revealed has left Doug Weiss and Joanie Lamb completely stunned. For years, whispers surrounded their lives, but nothing prepared anyone for this. Lisa's shocking words don't just tell her side, they rip open secrets that could shake everything we thought we knew about their story. This isn't just drama, it's a bombshell that could change their reputations, their future, and possibly the entire legacy they've tried to protect. For more than 3 decades, Lisa Weiss lived in the background of a story that everyone thought they knew. To the outside world, Doug Weiss was a strong Christian counselor, the man with the right answers for every broken marriage, the teacher who could guide families back to love and faith. And standing next to that image, though rarely seen, was Lisa, his wife, the woman who had carried the weight of their home, raised their children, and kept everything steady while Doug stood in the spotlight. People often told her how blessed she must feel to be married to a man like him. They praised his books, his speeches, his television appearances, and they assumed Lisa was living inside the perfect marriage he described. She smiled politely when they said those things, but inside she felt a quiet ache that never left her. At home, away from the stage lights and cameras, the reality was far different. Lisa had long grown used to the silence that filled their house, the way Doug seemed more connected to his audiences than to her. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, always planning the next event or thinking about his next book. She sat at the dinner table, night after night, waiting for him to notice her, to ask about her day, to share something more than passing words. But most evenings passed in silence. Lisa became invisible in her own marriage, fading into the background while the world believed she was living a fairy tale. For years, she kept it to herself. She convinced herself that this was her cross to bear, that if she just prayed harder or waited longer, Doug would one day see her again. She stayed loyal to him, even when the loneliness felt unbearable. And all the while, she helped protect the image he built. Every time she went to a church event or smiled in a family photo, she was silently covering the cracks in their story. But by 2024, Lisa had carried the silence for too long. Something inside her shifted, and she decided she could no longer live in the shadows of someone else's carefully crafted image. For the first time, she spoke publicly about her marriage, and her words were raw and honest. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply told the truth as she had lived it. What it felt like to be unseen, unheard, and forgotten, while the man she married preached about love and commitment to thousands. Her voice trembled, but it was steady, and in that moment, Lisa finally stepped into the light. Her story shocked many who had admired Doug for years, but for Lisa, it was less about exposing him and more about freeing herself. She was no longer willing to protect an image that had left her broken. By breaking her silence, she found her own voice, her own strength, and a chance to finally be known not just as Doug's wife, but as Lisa, a woman with her own story to tell. When Lisa Weiss finally spoke out, the words she shared carried more weight than anyone expected. For years, she had been silent, carrying the burden of her private pain while watching her ex-husband, Doug Weiss, step into a new marriage with Joanie Lamb. To the public, Doug and Joanie were a picture of renewal and hope. Two people who had found love again and were ready to write a new chapter. Their smiles, their public appearances, and the way they carried themselves painted a story that seemed almost untouchable. But Lisa's voice broke through that polished surface, and the secret she revealed began to shake everything Doug and Joanie had worked to protect. At the heart of her words was the difference between the man Doug presented to the world and the man she had known for over 30 years. She spoke about what it felt like to live with someone who was admired everywhere else, yet absent at home. The details she shared weren't just about her loneliness, but about the disconnect between the image of a devoted Christian leader and the reality of a husband who rarely looked her in the eye. She described how painful it was to hear him speak from stages about cherishing your spouse when she often felt unseen sitting across the dinner table. For those who had believed in Doug's teachings, her story was unsettling. If the man who taught so many about faithfulness and intimacy had struggled so deeply in his own marriage, what did that say about the lessons he preached? What made Lisa's words even harder to ignore was the timing. Doug had remarried Joanie Lamb so quickly after his divorce that people had already been asking questions. The speed of it all didn't feel natural, and Lisa's story only added to the doubts. She didn't accuse Doug and Joanie of wrongdoing, but her truth painted a picture that made many wonder if their relationship had begun earlier than anyone admitted. Even still, Lisa told them that her relationship had begun earlier than anyone admitted. Even without proof, the possibility lingered, and with it came whispers that tarnished the new couple's fresh start.
He's destroying me. And I said, no, Joanie, something very bad has happened. And there's been an essay and all of this. Oh, no. And then she defended Pete. He's hurt Pete so much. The Pete that Rebecca and JW wrote a huge letter about. That Pete. The Pete that Rebecca and JW won't let into their home. That Pete is a good guy. She said that Susie was a pathological liar and that she had made these accusations against a very nice man, the chiropractor, who is deceased now, but has a record and attacked her. So I was in shock what Joanie was saying to me. I implored her. I said, please reconcile with Jonathan for yourself. That would be the hope. I saw that side of her. I can only say it's nothing like the Joanie on television. It's nothing like that sweet person. But I did see that person somewhat in the video where she was talking about Jonathan has been conducting a smear campaign. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I hadn't seen Jonathan conducting a smear campaign. I'd seen Jonathan.
Joanie herself, who had spent decades as the face of Daystar, wasn't untouched by Lisa's revelations. For so long, she had been admired as a woman of faith and strength, someone who stood firm through tragedy after losing her first husband, Marcus. Her marriage to Doug had been seen as a blessing, a second chance at happiness. But now, Lisa's voice cast shadows over that story. Suddenly, the questions weren't just about Doug. They were about Joanie, too. Had she chosen to ignore Lisa's pain? Had she stepped into a marriage built on brokenness without acknowledging the cost? Behind the scenes, those who once admired Doug and Joanie's union began to wrestle with uncomfortable truths. Churches and ministries that had welcomed Doug as a speaker started to hesitate. Supporters of Daystar wondered if Joanie's personal choices reflected the same integrity she once preached about on air. For a couple who had built so much of their reputation on faith and family, the exposure of Lisa's story was more than gossip. It was a direct hit to the credibility they had carefully maintained. The cracks widened as Lisa's word spread. Interviews, posts, and quiet conversations painted her not as a bitter ex-wife, but as a woman who had carried too much for too long. She wasn't throwing accusations wildly. She was measured, steady, and heartbreakingly honest. That honesty made her impossible to dismiss. She wasn't just telling a story about Doug. She was holding up a mirror to the expectations and pressures of Christian leaders everywhere, reminding people that sometimes the image is more performance than truth. For Doug and Joanie, the impact was immediate. Their names became tied to Lisa's revelations, and the whispers of hypocrisy grew louder. They may have hoped to build their future free from the weight of the past, but the secrets Lisa revealed made that impossible. Every sermon, every appearance, every smiling photo was now viewed through the lens of her words. Supporters questioned if their ministry could survive the shadow now hanging over it. Critics wondered if their relationship had been rushed or even rooted in deception. The weight of these secrets wasn't just on Doug and Joanie as individuals. It extended to everything connected to them. For Joanie, that meant Daystar, the network she had co-founded and nurtured for decades. For Doug, it meant his books, his reputation as a marriage counselor, and his credibility as a Christian leader. Lisa's voice had shaken not only their personal lives, but also their professional worlds. And yet, beneath all the noise, there was something deeply human in the story. At its core, it wasn't about destroying Doug and Joanie. It was about Lisa finally being seen after years of silence. Her story was one of truth breaking through an illusion, and in doing so, it reminded the world that even those who seem untouchable are not immune to brokenness. For Doug and Joanie, that truth left them exposed. The secrets Lisa carried into the light had changed everything, and nothing about their story would ever look the same again. When Lisa Weiss's words finally broke into the open, the public reaction was instant, raw, and divided in a way that no one could have predicted. For years, Doug Weiss and Joanie Lamb had carefully built a public image that looked almost untouchable. Doug was the marriage counselor with the answers, the man who stood in pulpits and on conference stages, teaching couples how to hold their marriages together through faith and sacrifice. Joanie was the face of Daystar, the grieving widow who had carried on after the loss of Marcus Lamb, admired for her strength, her resilience, and her ability to inspire millions of viewers. Together, they had become a symbol of faith, hope, and second chances. But when Lisa's voice entered the story, it felt as though the curtain had been ripped back. and what people saw left them stunned. Some people immediately believed Lisa. Her story didn't come across like a bitter rant or a jealous ex trying to ruin her former husband's life. Instead, her words were calm, thoughtful, and deeply human. She spoke with the kind of quiet pain that felt impossible to fake. She didn't scream accusations, but instead painted a picture of years spent feeling invisible, of living with a man who taught strangers how to cherish their wives while his own wife felt unseen at home. For many listeners, her story rang true. It was the kind of truth that made them stop and rethink everything they thought they knew about Doug and Joanie. But not everyone reacted that way. For a large group of Doug and Joanie's supporters, Lisa's words were seen as an attack, a bitter attempt to tear down a marriage blessed by God. They rushed to defend the couple, posting online about forgiveness, second chances, and the idea that no one should try to destroy what God had put together. In their eyes, Doug and Joanie's union was a testimony of grace after hardship, and Lisa's willingness to air her pain publicly was viewed as harmful, even sinful. And then, these videos actually became harmful. Social media became a battleground where strangers argued fiercely, some lifting up Lisa as brave for finally speaking out, while others dismissed her as jealous and resentful. The shock was not just about Lisa's words, but about what they revealed beneath the surface. People had admired Doug for years, not just as a man, but as a voice of authority on love, loyalty, and marriage. To hear that his own wife of 3 decades had felt neglected and abandoned cut deep for many. How could the man who wrote books about intimacy and preached about faithfulness fail so profoundly at home? That question alone divided audiences. Some saw it as proof of hypocrisy, a reminder that leaders are human and sometimes live double lives. Others argued that no one is perfect, that even Christian leaders can fail, and that Lisa's story didn't erase the good Doug had done in his ministry. For Joanie, the reactions were just as complicated. She had spent years winning the trust and admiration of her audience, especially after Marcus's death. Many had looked at her remarriage to Doug as a beautiful new beginning, a sign of God's restoration in her life. Now, Lisa's revelations cast shadows over that story. Some began to question Joanie's judgment, wondering if she had turned a blind eye to Lisa's pain or if she had stepped into a marriage that was rushed and messy. Others defended her fiercely, saying that she had every right to move on with her life and that her love for Doug didn't make her responsible for his past. The division was sharp, and the debates only seemed to grow louder as more people weighed in. Church communities and Christian media outlets also felt the tremors. For years, Doug had been welcomed as a trusted voice in marriage counseling, while Joanie had been seen as one of the most influential women in Christian broadcasting. Their marriage had been celebrated publicly, a union that symbolized healing and hope. Now, with Lisa's voice out in the open, many leaders didn't know where to stand. Some distanced themselves quietly, choosing not to book Doug for speaking engagements or avoiding commentary about Joanie's personal life. Others doubled down in their support, insisting that the couple's ministry and calling weren't defined by Lisa's pain. The public shock also revealed a deeper truth. People were uncomfortable with the idea that their heroes could be flawed. Fans who had followed Doug and Joanie for years struggled with the contradiction between the image they had admired and the messy reality now exposed. Some were angry, feeling betrayed by the illusion of perfection they had been sold. Others were heartbroken, realizing that the leaders they trusted were just as vulnerable to brokenness as anyone else. The divide wasn't just about Doug and Joanie, it was about how people deal with disappointment when the figures they admire fall short of their expectations. Lisa's story had become bigger than just her marriage. It tapped into something universal, the gap between public image and private reality. That was why the reactions were so intense, why the shock rippled so far. People weren't just reacting to Doug and Joanie, they were confronting their own ideas of trust, faith, and authenticity. In the end, the divided reactions weren't simply about choosing sides. They revealed a deeper struggle within communities of faith, one that asked whether honesty should matter more than image, whether pain should be silenced to protect reputations, or whether telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was the only way forward. For Doug and Joanie, the fallout from the shock was impossible to ignore. Every appearance, every sermon, every interview now carried the weight of Lisa's words. For Lisa, the response was bittersweet. Some embraced her, finally seeing the years of hurt she had carried. Others rejected her, questioning her motives and painting her as an enemy of the very ministry she had once supported. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever go back to the way it was. This is the truth of the way it was, and it is not to be conformed to the way it was. The public had seen too much, heard too much, and the cracks in the story of Doug and Joanie could no longer be hidden. Lisa Weiss never planned to become the center of attention. For most of her life, she was content to stand in the background, supporting her husband, raising her children, and holding her family together while Doug Weiss built his ministry and reputation. She didn't crave the spotlight, and she certainly didn't want her name to be tied to scandal or public drama. But sometimes life pushes you into a place you never expected, and for Lisa, that moment came when her pain finally grew too heavy to carry in silence. What she once tried to hide became the very thing that gave her a new kind of strength. Her pain became her power. For years, Lisa lived in the quiet shadows of her marriage. Doug was celebrated everywhere he went. Churches booked him to speak, Christian couples bought his books, and people trusted him as the expert on saving marriages. Lisa played her role as the supportive wife, smiling for photos and standing by his side when the cameras were on. But when the lights turned off and the audiences went home, she felt alone. Doug was either traveling or distracted, and when he was physically present, it often felt like his heart was somewhere else. At first, Lisa did what so many women in her position do. She told herself to be patient. She prayed harder. She convinced herself that things would get better. She believed that if she was just strong enough, loyal enough, and faithful enough, Doug would notice her again. But instead of change, she only felt more invisible. The words he spoke on stage about cherishing your spouse never seemed to make their way into their own home. She was surrounded by his success, but starved for his attention. For decades, Lisa stayed silent. She kept up appearances, even when her heart was breaking. She thought her silence was protecting Doug, protecting their family, and protecting the ministry they had built together. She believed that if she told anyone what was really going on, no one would believe her. People saw Doug as a man of God, a man of wisdom. Who would believe that behind closed doors, his wife felt unseen and unloved, and so she carried it alone, burying her pain deep inside. But silence has a way of eating you alive. Over the years, Lisa felt herself disappearing. She began to wonder who she even was anymore. Was she just Doug's wife? Was her only role to be the support system while he poured himself into strangers? The emptiness weighed on her, and though she hid it well, the cracks inside were growing wider every year. When Doug remarried so quickly after their divorce, Lisa's silence shattered. It wasn't just the fact that he had moved on. It was how fast it happened, how public it was, and how easily it seemed to erase the 30 years they had shared together. Seeing the man she had sacrificed for now standing proudly with another woman was like salt in wounds that were still fresh. And for Lisa, something shifted. She realized that if she didn't tell her story, no one would. If she didn't speak her truth, she would disappear completely, erased not only from Doug's life, but from the narrative of their shared history. So she spoke, and when she did, it wasn't with bitterness or rage. It was with clarity, honesty, and a raw vulnerability that people couldn't ignore. She told the world what it was like to be married to a man who preached about love, but left her feeling unloved. She shared the reality of what it meant to live in the shadow of someone else's ministry, while slowly losing yourself in the process. She didn't scream or accuse. She simply told the truth, and that truth carried more power than she ever imagined. The response shocked her. People who had admired Doug for years suddenly began to question the image they had trusted. Lisa's calm, steady voice made them pause. She wasn't out to destroy anyone. She was out to reclaim herself. Her pain, which she had once tried so hard to bury, had become the very thing that gave her strength. Women began reaching out, saying they saw themselves in her story. They too had felt invisible in their marriages. They too had sacrificed themselves for the sake of appearances. Lisa's honesty gave them courage to face their own truths. For Lisa, this was a turning point. For so long, she had thought her pain was a weakness, something shameful to keep hidden. But when she spoke it aloud, it transformed into power. It didn't erase the years of loneliness or betrayal, but it gave them meaning. Her story became more than just her own. It became a voice for countless others who had never been able to speak. That power didn't come easily. Lisa still had nights when she cried herself to sleep, still had mornings when the weight of everything felt unbearable. Healing didn't come in one grand moment. It came in small, fragile steps. Writing in her journal, talking to a trusted friend, taking long walks to clear her mind, whispering prayers not just for Doug or her children, but for herself. For the strength to believe she still mattered. Slowly, Lisa began to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just Doug's ex-wife. She wasn't just the woman who had been left behind. She was a survivor, a mother, a woman of faith, and now a voice that others were listening to. The more she embraced her story, the stronger she felt. Her pain hadn't destroyed her, it had refined her. It had pushed her into a place where she could no longer hide, and in that exposure, she found freedom. Even as critics accused her of bitterness, Lisa stood firm. She wasn't bitter. She was honest. She wasn't trying to ruin Doug and Joanie. She was reclaiming her own dignity. She understood that some people would never see it that way, but she no longer cared. For the first time in decades, she felt seen. Not because of who her husband was, but because of who she was. Lisa's pain had become her power, not because it erased the suffering, but because it gave her a voice that mattered, a voice that resonated, a voice that reminded others that even in the darkest moments, there is strength waiting to be uncovered. And as she continued to speak, Lisa wasn't just telling her story. She was building a new one, a story where she wasn't in the shadows anymore, but standing fully in the light, stronger than she had ever been before.